I never imagined that the person who claimed to love me most would one day throw my handmade gift into the trash like it meant nothing. But today, I witnessed it with my own eyes, and the memory seared itself into my mind like a brand. Derrick, my fiancé, the man I'd planned to spend my life with, took the scarf I'd spent 2 weeks knitting and tossed it into the garbage bin as if it were worthless packaging. I stood there, completely frozen, feeling like someone had driven a dagger straight through my chest. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath away. "Seriously, Jordan?" he said without even turning around, his voice dripping with dismissal. "You're still making these childish gifts? Grow up already." His words didn't just hurt me. They shattered something fundamental inside. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to explain that the scarf represented hours of love and effort, but what could I say? How do you argue with someone who has reduced your affection to an insult? I simply left the room, casting one final glance at that trash bin where all my feelings now lay discarded among coffee grounds and crumpled papers. As I descended the stairs of our building, my heart felt so heavy that even breathing became difficult. The sidewalk outside was crowded with people rushing to their destinations, but I felt utterly alone in the midst of that human river. I thought perhaps fresh air would help ease the tightness in my chest, but it didn't. Fighting back tears, I started walking toward our apartment, though each step felt weighted with lead. The city sounds around me, car horns, distant conversations, the rumble of the subway beneath, all seemed muffled, as if I were moving through water. Then, unexpectedly, a voice stopped me in my tracks. "Excuse me," came the words, delivered in a deep tone that somehow managed to be both smooth and commanding. I turned around, and standing before me was a man who seemed somehow different from everyone else on that busy street. He was tall with a sharp jawline, and his eyes looked directly into mine with an intensity that made my heart skip. In his hands he held the scarf, the very same one Derrick had thrown away. My pulse quickened instantly. "Is this yours?" he asked, folding the scarf gently as though it were something precious and delicate. I stared at him in complete confusion, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Where did you get that?" I asked hesitantly, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He smiled then, subtle but unmistakably genuine. "I saw it in the trash bin upstairs, but this doesn't look like trash to me. Someone put real effort into making this." Hearing those words, tears welled up in my eyes, though I fought desperately to hold them back. Who was this stranger, and why had he rescued something that my own fiancé had discarded? "I'm George," he said, extending his hand toward me in introduction. "And I think you should have this back." I looked into his eyes and saw no pity there, only understanding and respect. I took the scarf from his hands, and in that moment of contact I felt an inexplicable connection spark between us. "Jordan," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. George nodded, and then he said something that would change everything for me. "If someone in your life has treated you as disposable, then perhaps it's time you rewrote your story. Are you ready for that, Jordan? Could we start again?" That night, lying awake in bed while Derrick slept soundly beside me, I replayed George's words over and over in my mind. For the first time in months, maybe years, I allowed myself to consider that maybe this wasn't an ending. Maybe it was actually a new beginning waiting to unfold. The scarf lay on my nightstand, carefully folded, and I reached out to touch it in the darkness. The soft yarn between my fingers reminded me that I was capable of creating something beautiful, something worthy of appreciation. Perhaps I had simply been offering my gifts to the wrong person. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, matching the confusion swirling inside me. Derrick was already gone when I woke, having left early for some meeting he'd mentioned but I'd barely registered. I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee, staring at the scarf I'd brought from the bedroom. Every stitch represented a moment of care, a thought of Derrick, a hope for our future together, but he had seen it as childish, as worthless, as something to be thrown away without a second thought. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. If he could dismiss my love so easily, what else had he been dismissing all this time? I thought about George, the stranger who had seen value where Derrick saw garbage. What kind of person stops to rescue something from the trash because they recognize the effort and care it represents? What kind of person takes the time to return it to its creator? These questions circled through my mind as I got ready for work, each one pulling me further from the life I'd been living, and closer to something I couldn't quite name yet. Change, perhaps, or possibility, or simply the courage to acknowledge that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting. The scarf went into my work bag, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. I couldn't leave it at the apartment where Derrick might find it again and finish what he'd started. At the office, I tucked it into my desk drawer, hidden away but close enough that I could touch it whenever I needed a reminder. A reminder that my feelings mattered, that my efforts had value, that somewhere in this city there was at least one person who understood that handmade gifts weren't childish. They were treasures. As I sat at my desk trying to focus on spreadsheets and emails, my mind kept drifting back to that moment on the sidewalk. George's eyes had held something I hadn't seen in Derrick's gaze for longer than I could remember, genuine interest in me as a person, not as an accessory to his life, not as someone who should conform to his expectations, but as someone with inherent worth. The contrast was stark and painful. How had I not noticed how small Derrick made me feel? How had I convinced myself that his criticism was guidance, his dismissal was honesty, his coldness was just his personality? The day dragged on, each hour feeling longer than the last. My phone buzzed occasionally with messages from Derrick, reminders about dinner plans, complaints about work, questions about mundane household matters, but nothing acknowledging what had happened the night before, nothing approaching an apology. It was as if throwing away my gift had been such a trivial event that it didn't even register in his memory. That realization hurt almost more than the original act. At least if he'd been angry or defensive, it would mean he understood he'd hurt me. This indifference suggested he simply didn't care enough to notice. When 5 o'clock finally arrived, I packed up my things slowly, reluctant to return to the apartment and face another evening of emotional emptiness. But as I stepped out of the office building into the cooling evening air, I felt something shift inside me. George's question echoed in my mind. "Are you ready? Could we start again?" I didn't know if he'd meant those words romantically or simply as encouragement to value myself more. But standing there on the sidewalk, watching strangers hurry past to lives I knew nothing about, I realized something crucial. I was ready. Ready for change. Ready to stop accepting less than I deserved. Ready to rewrite my story even if I didn't yet know what the next chapter would hold. Morning came too quickly, and with it the necessity of facing another day. I arrived at the office early, hoping the quiet would help me organize my scattered thoughts. The scarf incident still weighed heavily on my mind, but so did something else. The memory of George's kindness, his perceptive eyes, the way he'd treated my handmade gift with reverence. I pulled the scarf from my drawer and studied it closely, running my fingers over each carefully crafted stitch, remembering the hope I'd felt while making it. Did someone out there truly exist who could appreciate such gestures? Or had I simply encountered a polite stranger who would soon fade into the background of city life? My coworkers began trickling in around 8:30, their usual morning chatter filling the open office space. I tried to focus on the project deadline looming next week, but concentration proved impossible. My mind kept wandering back to that moment on the sidewalk. The unexpected warmth in George's voice. The way he'd looked at me as if I mattered. It felt dangerous to dwell on a stranger's kindness, especially when my relationship with Derrick was already so fractured. Yet I couldn't stop replaying the encounter, searching for meaning in every word he'd spoken. Around 10 o'clock, our department manager sent out an urgent meeting notification. All staff to conference room immediately. Major company announcements. The message sent a ripple of speculation through the office. Merger rumors had been circulating for months, but management had remained tight-lipped about specifics. My colleague Rachel leaned over her cubicle divider and whispered, "I heard we're being acquired by Sinclair Industries. Apparently their CEO is ruthless." I nodded absently, only half listening. Corporate politics typically didn't interest me much. I preferred to keep my head down and do my work. The conference room was already packed when I arrived, standing room only along the back wall. Our CEO stood at the front, looking nervous despite his forced smile. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," he began, his voice carrying that particular pitch that suggested carefully rehearsed remarks. "As you've probably heard, we've been in negotiations for several months about a strategic partnership. I'm pleased to announce that as of today, Sinclair Industries has officially merged with our company. Their CEO will be taking a co-leadership role, and we expect this transition to bring exciting opportunities for growth. The door opened then, and my entire world tilted sideways. George walked into the conference room with the confident stride of someone who belonged everywhere he went. He wore an impeccably tailored suit that somehow made him look even more striking than he had yesterday in casual clothes. My heart stopped, then started again with a painful thud. This couldn't be happening. The man who had rescued my scarf from the garbage was now standing at the front of the room as our new CEO. The universe couldn't possibly be this cruel or this kind. I hadn't yet decided which. George's eyes swept across the assembled employees, professional and assessing, until they landed on me. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps. Or surprise. But he smoothly continued his visual survey of the room, as if that moment hadn't happened. Was I imagining things? Had he even remembered me? Maybe yesterday's encounter had meant nothing to him, just another forgettable moment in a busy executive's life. The thought made my stomach sink. "Thank you for the warm welcome," George said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room. "I know mergers can be unsettling, but I want to assure you that my primary goal is to preserve what makes this company special while introducing innovations that will benefit everyone. Over the next few weeks, I'll be meeting with each department to understand your work and hear your ideas. I believe the best solutions come from listening to the people who do the actual work, not from executives in ivory towers." His words sparked approving murmurs around the room. He had a gift for sounding genuine, for making people feel valued. Or perhaps, I thought with a flutter of hope, he actually meant what he said. The meeting continued with discussions of organizational structure and timeline expectations, but I barely processed any of it. My mind was reeling. George was Derrick's rival. That much was clear from the tension radiating from Derrick's rigid posture near the front of the room. Derrick had mentioned Sinclair Industries numerous times over the years, always with thinly veiled hostility. They competed for the same contracts, moved in the same business circles, and apparently shared a history of professional antagonism. And now George would be working in the same building, just floors above where I sat every day. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out, George's voice cut through the noise. "Jordan, could you stay behind for a moment?" The request made several heads turn, including Derrick's. I felt heat rise to my face as I made my way to the front of the room, acutely aware of all the eyes following my movements. Derrick's expression was thunderous, but he couldn't very well object to a direct request from the new CEO. He shot me a look that promised an interrogation later before stalking out with the others. Soon the room emptied until only George and I remained. He closed the door gently and turned to face me, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "I apologize if that put you in an awkward position," he said quietly, "but I wanted to speak with you, and given our prior acquaintance, I thought it best to be direct." My mouth had gone completely dry. "I was surprised to see you," I managed to say, which felt like the understatement of the century. "Actually, I was shocked." George smiled then, and it was the same genuine expression from yesterday, not the polished executive smile he'd worn during the presentation. "I recognized your name on the employee roster this morning. I almost couldn't believe it. What are the odds?" He moved closer, not inappropriately so, but enough that I could smell his subtle cologne. "Jordan, I want to be completely transparent with you. I think you do excellent work based on the reports I've reviewed. I'd like you to join my direct team for the integration project. It's a significant opportunity and I believe you'd be an asset. But I need to know if our encounter yesterday makes this uncomfortable for you." My mind raced. Working directly with George meant working against Derrick, at least in terms of office dynamics. It meant daily interaction with the man who had shown me more kindness in 5 minutes than my fiancé had shown in months. It meant stepping into the spotlight when I'd spent years trying to remain invisible. But it also meant possibility, growth, a chance to do work that might actually be appreciated. "I'd like to think about it," I said carefully. "This is all very sudden." "Of course," George replied. "Take whatever time you need." He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to me. "My direct number is on here. When you've decided, let me know." And Jordan, I met his eyes, surprised by the intensity there. What I said yesterday still stands. You deserve to have your efforts valued. Whether that's here at work or anywhere else in your life. With those words hanging in the air between us, he left the conference room, leaving me alone with a decision that felt far more complicated than it should have been. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the business card in my hand. The paper was heavy, expensive, embossed with George's name and title. My phone buzzed insistently. Derrick, no doubt demanding to know what George had wanted, but I silenced it without looking, needing just a few more minutes in this quiet space to process everything that had just happened. The scarf was still in my desk drawer. George was now my potential boss. Derrick was waiting at home with questions I didn't know how to answer, and I was standing at a crossroads, finally understanding that every choice I made from this point forward would determine not just my career but the entire trajectory of my life. The question was, did I have the courage to choose myself for once? By the time lunch rolled around, I'd been approached by at least 6 coworkers wanting to know why the new CEO had singled me out. Rachel cornered me at my desk with barely contained curiosity. So, what did he want? Are you in trouble? Being promoted? Come on, Jordan. You have to give me something. I deflected as best I could, claiming it was just routine questions about department procedures. She looked skeptical but eventually backed off when I buried myself in spreadsheets with exaggerated focus. The truth was, I'd spent the entire morning weighing George's offer. On paper, it was an incredible opportunity. Direct access to executive-level projects, visibility that could accelerate my career, escape from Derrick's constant oversight since we worked on different teams, but accepting meant walking into a political minefield. Derrick already resented George's presence in the company. If I joined George's team, it would feel like choosing sides in a battle I didn't fully understand. Yet staying where I was meant remaining small, invisible, and forever wondering what might have been. Around 2 o'clock, I made my decision. I pulled out George's business card, my fingers trembling slightly as I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. George speaking. His voice was crisp, professional, clearly in the middle of a busy day. It's Jordan, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I've thought about your offer. I'd like to accept, if the position is still available. There was a brief pause, then warmth flooded back into his tone. I'm very glad to hear that. Can you come up to the executive floor at 3? We'll discuss the details and get you set up with the project files. I'll be there, I confirmed, then added, thank you for this opportunity. After hanging up, I sat motionless for several minutes, trying to absorb what I'd just done. I'd made a choice not based on fear or obligation or trying to keep peace, but based on what I wanted. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. I hadn't chosen something for myself in so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Before I could second-guess the decision, I sent a quick email to HR requesting the team transfer and copying my current supervisor. The response came within minutes, followed immediately by Derrick appearing at my cubicle. His expression was carefully neutral, but tension radiated from every line of his body. Can we talk? He asked, his voice low. Outside, I nodded, gathering my phone and following him to the small outdoor courtyard the company maintained for breaks. The afternoon sun was bright, almost accusatory in its cheerfulness given the confrontation I knew was coming. What's going on, Jordan? Derrick demanded once we were alone among the landscaped plants and decorative benches. You're transferring to George's team, without even discussing it with me first. I faced him squarely, feeling something inside me straighten like a steel rod. It's a professional decision, Derrick. An opportunity for advancement. I didn't realize I needed your permission to make career choices. My words came out sharper than intended, but I didn't soften them. Part of me wanted this confrontation, needed it even. Don't play naive. He snapped, his professional veneer cracking. You know exactly what this looks like. George Sinclair is my competitor. Has been for years. Him offering you a position isn't about your qualifications. It's about getting to me. The accusation stung, partly because a small voice in my head wondered if he might be right. But then I remembered the scarf, remembered George's respectful treatment of something Derrick had literally thrown in the garbage. Maybe, I said slowly, you should consider that not everything is about you. Maybe George simply recognizes talent when he sees it. Maybe he values effort and dedication. Unlike some people, The reference to the scarf hung unspoken between us. But Derrick's face flushed. Is this about that ridiculous gift? You're still upset about that? His dismissive tone ignited something in me that had been smoldering for months. Yes, Derrick. I'm still upset about it. You threw away something I made with my own hands, something that took weeks of work, like it was garbage. And then you had the nerve to call me childish for caring. Do you have any idea how that felt? Oh, for God's sake, he muttered, running his hands through his hair in frustration. It was just a scarf, Jordan. You're being completely irrational about this. I've apologized. No, I interrupted, my voice rising. You actually haven't. You've explained why you did it, you've told me I'm overreacting, but you've never once said you're sorry. We stared at each other across the divide that had been growing between us for longer than either of us wanted to admit. Finally, Derrick's expression shifted to something calculating. Fine, work with George if you want, but don't come crying to me when you realize he's just using you to gather information about our team's projects. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing alone in the courtyard with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to chase after him, to smooth things over, to make peace the way I always had before, but I stayed rooted to the spot, forcing myself to sit with the discomfort of conflict instead of immediately trying to fix it. This was growth, I told myself. This was what choosing yourself looked like. It didn't feel triumphant or empowering. It felt messy and painful and uncertain, but it also felt necessary. At 3 o'clock sharp, I took the elevator to the executive floor. The decor up here was noticeably more upscale. Real artwork on the walls, plush carpeting, floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular city views. George's assistant, a friendly woman named Patricia, greeted me warmly and showed me into his office. The space was modern but not cold, with comfortable seating and bookshelves lined with both business texts and literary novels. George stood when I entered, gesturing to the chairs arranged around a small conference table. Jordan, thank you for coming up. Please have a seat. We spent the next hour discussing the integration project. Objectives, timelines, deliverables. George was all business, but his approach was collaborative rather than dictatorial. He asked for my input on various aspects, genuinely listened to my suggestions, and explained his reasoning when he disagreed. It was refreshing after years of Derrick simply telling me what to do and expecting unquestioning compliance. As we worked through the project outline, I found myself relaxing, even enjoying the intellectual challenge of the work. I think that covers the basics, George finally said, leaning back in his chair. You'll receive access to all the relevant files by tomorrow morning. We'll have weekly check-ins, more often if needed. He paused, his expression becoming more personal. Jordan, I want to address something directly. Your fiancé is Derrick Morrison, correct? My stomach dropped. Yes. How did you? I make it my business to understand workplace dynamics, he said simply. I need to know if this creates a conflict for you. I don't want to put you in a difficult position between your personal and professional life. I took a deep breath, appreciating his directness even as the question made me uncomfortable. Derrick and I were working through some issues, but my professional choices are my own. I accepted this position because I believe in the work, not because of any personal dynamics. George nodded slowly, studying my face with those perceptive eyes. Fair enough. Just know that my door is always open if you need to discuss any concerns, professional or otherwise. The or otherwise hung in the air with weight I wasn't ready to examine. As I left his office and headed back downstairs, my phone buzzed with a text from Derrick. We need to talk tonight. About everything. I stared at the message, knowing that conversation would be uncomfortable at best, explosive at worst. But for the first time in our relationship, I wasn't afraid of his reaction. I'd made a choice for myself, and whatever consequences came from that, I'd handle them. The scarf was still in my desk drawer, a reminder that someone in this world saw value in things Derrick dismissed. And maybe, just maybe, that same someone could help me remember how to value myself again. The following week brought changes I hadn't anticipated. Derrick noticed immediately that something fundamental had shifted in our dynamic. The Jordan who used to accommodate his every whim, who nodded along to his criticisms and swallowed his complaints, had been replaced by someone who questioned, who pushed back, who claimed space. And it terrified him. He started showing up at my office building unannounced, waiting by my car with coffee and forced smiles. He'd text constantly throughout the day asking where I was, what I was doing, who I was with. The attention felt suffocating rather than loving, possessive rather than protective. Thursday evening he surprised me by cooking an elaborate dinner at home. Candles flickered on the dining table, wine breathed in crystal glasses, and classical music played softly from the speakers. It was the kind of romantic gesture he'd never bothered with before, and its sudden appearance felt more manipulative than genuine. I sat across from him, watching him serve the meal with exaggerated care, and felt nothing but exhaustion. "I thought we could use some quality time together," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We've barely seen each other lately." "I've been busy with the integration project," I replied neutrally, accepting the plate he offered. "George has high standards." At the mention of George's name, Derrick's jaw tightened visibly. He set down the serving spoon with more force than necessary. "Yes, George, you spend an awful lot of time with him these days. Late nights at the office, lunch meetings, weekend work sessions. Should I be concerned?" His tone tried for casual but landed firmly on accusatory. I set my fork down carefully, feeling anger kindle in my chest. "Are you seriously asking me that after years of you working late, taking business trips, canceling plans because something at the office came up? Now suddenly you're concerned about my work schedule. That's different," he snapped. "My work is important, but you're just an analyst, Jordan. You don't need to be spending every waking moment with the CEO." The dismissal in his words, the casual way he diminished my career, sparked something explosive inside me. "Just an analyst," I repeated slowly. "Is that how you've always seen me? As somehow less important than you?" Derrick's face flushed red. "I didn't mean it like that. You're twisting my words." "No," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm finally hearing them clearly. You've never respected what I do. You've never valued my contributions. And when I tried to show you love through handmade gifts, you literally threw them away like garbage." The reference to the scarf hung between us like an accusation. Derrick stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We're back to that again? One mistake and you're going to hold it over my head forever? One mistake?" I stood as well, my hands trembling. "Derrick, it wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern. Years of small dismissals, tiny cruelties, moments where you made me feel small. The scarf was just the moment I finally saw it clearly." We faced each other across the ruined romantic dinner, two strangers who had somehow convinced themselves they were in love. "So what do you want from me?" he demanded. "An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. There. Are we done with this?" His words were empty, performative, and we both knew it. I shook my head slowly. "That's not a real apology, and we both know it. You're sorry I'm upset, not sorry for what you did. There's a difference." Derrick's expression shifted from anger to something calculating. "If you're so unhappy, maybe you should leave. I'm not going to beg you to stay in a relationship you clearly don't want anymore." The words were meant to call my bluff, to make me back down and scramble to reassure him. Instead, they freed me. "You're right," I said quietly. "Maybe I should." The color drained from his face as he realized I wasn't going to fold. "Jordan, wait." But I was already walking toward the bedroom, my decision crystallizing with each step. I spent the night in the guest room, lying awake and planning my exit strategy. By dawn I knew exactly what I needed to do. Morning light filtered through the curtains as I pulled my suitcase from the closet. The sound brought Derrick rushing into the room, his hair disheveled from sleep, panic written across his features. "What are you doing?" "I'm leaving," I said simply, folding clothes with methodical precision. "You told me last night that if I was unhappy I should go. So I'm going." He grabbed my arm, not roughly but desperately. "I didn't mean it. You know I didn't mean it. We can work through this, Jordan. People fight. It's normal. Don't throw away everything we've built together." I gently extracted my arm from his grip. "What have we built, Derrick? Really? A relationship where I constantly diminish myself to make you comfortable? Where my feelings don't matter unless they align with yours? That's not something worth saving. Please," he said, and his voice cracked. "I'll change. I promise I'll change. Just give me another chance." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone who would promise anything to avoid losing. Not because he actually understood what he'd done wrong. You've made that promise before, I said gently. Multiple times. But you never follow through because you don't actually think you need to change. You think I need to stop being so sensitive. The truth of my words settled over both of us. I reached for my hand, sliding off the engagement ring that had once symbolized forever. The metal felt cold and foreign as I pressed it into his palm. I deserve better than this, Derrick. And somewhere deep down, I think you know that. I walked out with my suitcase, leaving behind years of compromise and the ghost of who I'd been trying to be. Outside, the morning air felt crisp and clean, filling my lungs with possibility. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and found George's number. My heart hammered as I pressed call, suddenly terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Hello? His voice was rough with sleep, but instantly alert. George, I managed. I need to see you. Can we meet somewhere? There was no hesitation in his response. Of course. Where are you? I'll come right now. As I gave him the address of a nearby cafe, I felt the weight of my decision settle into something like relief. Whatever came next, I was finally choosing it for myself. The cafe George suggested was tucked away on a quiet street I'd never noticed before. The kind of place locals treasured and tourists never found. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in streams of golden morning light, and the smell of fresh coffee wrapped around me like a comfort. George was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups steaming in front of him. He stood when he saw me, and the concern etched across his features made my throat tighten. Jordan, he said softly, gesturing to the chair across from him. I got you a cappuccino. I hope that's all right. I sank into the seat gratefully, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. George seemed content to wait, to let me gather my thoughts without pressure. It was such a stark contrast to Derrick's constant demands for immediate explanations that I almost laughed. I left him, I finally said, the words tumbling out abruptly. This morning, I ended my engagement. George's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. How are you feeling? It was such a simple question, but no one else had bothered to ask it. Not about how I felt, only about what had happened or what I planned to do next. Honestly, I took a shaky breath. I feel relieved. Terrified, but relieved. Like I've been holding my breath for years and can finally exhale. George reached across the table, his hand hovering near mine in invitation rather than assumption. I slid my palm into his, and his fingers closed around mine with gentle firmness. Leaving takes courage, he said. Especially when you're walking away from what's familiar, even if it wasn't healthy. I'm proud of you. The sincerity in his voice nearly undid me. Tears threatened, but I blinked them back, determined to get through this conversation without falling apart completely. We talked for hours as the cafe filled and emptied around us. George shared pieces of his own history I hadn't known, a relationship that had slowly eroded his sense of self until he barely recognized the person staring back from the mirror. I stayed too long, he admitted, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the back of my hand. Kept thinking if I just tried harder, compromised more, that things would improve. But you can't fix a relationship where only one person is willing to change. His words resonated so deeply I felt them in my bones. How did you finally leave? I woke up one morning and realized I'd stopped being a person and become an accessory to someone else's life, he said. Every decision I made was filtered through what they would think, what they would want, how they would react. I'd completely lost myself. He squeezed my hand gently. I recognized that same loss in your eyes when we met on the sidewalk. That's why I stopped. Because I remembered how desperately I'd needed someone to see me when I was drowning. The confession hung between us, intimate and raw. I'm not trying to take advantage of your vulnerability, George continued. If you need space, time to figure out who you are outside of that relationship, I completely understand. But I want you to know that I see you, Jordan, not as a project to fix or a prize to win, just as someone worth knowing. My heart stuttered in my chest. And if I said I didn't want space, that I wanted to see where this could go. George's expression softened into something that made my breath catch. Then I'd say we should take it slow. Let you find your footing again. Build something healthy from the ground up. The promise in his words felt like solid ground after years of quicksand. When we finally left the cafe, the afternoon sun had begun its descent toward evening. George walked me to where I'd parked, neither of us ready to end the conversation, but both aware we'd covered heavy ground. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "Hotel for now," I admitted. "I need to find an apartment, start looking this weekend." "I have a friend who manages properties downtown," George offered. "Good buildings, reasonable rents. I could put you in touch if you'd like." The gesture was practical and thoughtful without being overbearing. "I'd appreciate that," I said. We stood beside my car, and the air between us felt charged with possibility. "Jordan," George said, then seemed to reconsider his words. "Would you have dinner with me tonight? Nothing formal, just food and conversation. No pressure, no expectations." Every rational part of my brain screamed that it was too soon, that I needed time to process, that jumping from one relationship to another was a mistake. But my heart, which had been quiet for so long, was finally speaking up. "Yes," I heard myself say. "I'd like that." George's apartment surprised me. I'd expected something sterile and modern, all sharp edges and expensive furniture. Instead, I found a space that felt lived in and welcoming. Bookshelves overflowed with well-worn volumes. Plants thrived in sunny corners, and artwork that looked personally chosen rather than professionally decorated covered the walls. "I'm not much of a chef," George admitted, leading me to the kitchen, "but I make a decent pasta if that works for you." "That sounds perfect," I assured him. We worked together in companionable silence, George cooking while I set the table and poured wine. The domesticity of it felt surreal. Just this morning I'd been ending one life and now I was tentatively beginning another. Over dinner we talked about everything except romance. Books we loved, places we wanted to travel, childhood memories that shaped who we'd become. George made me laugh with stories from his early career mishaps, and I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in years. As the evening wound down, George walked me to his door. "Thank you," I said, "for today, for listening, for not making this complicated." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face with heartbreaking gentleness. "Jordan, I want you to know something. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever pace you need to set, whatever boundaries you need to establish, I'll respect them. This isn't about rushing into something new. It's about building something real." Standing there in his doorway, I made a decision. Rising on my toes, I pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "Good night, George." His eyes were warm as he responded, "Good night, Jordan. Drive safe." As I drove back to my hotel, I caught myself smiling. For the first time in memory, I felt like myself again. Whoever that person turned out to be, I was excited to find out. 3 weeks passed in a blur of change and discovery. George's friend helped me find an apartment with hardwood floors and windows that flooded the space with natural light. I spent weekends at thrift stores and flea markets, curating belongings that actually reflected my taste rather than what Derrick had approved. Each purchase felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost. George appeared throughout this transition like a steady presence rather than an overwhelming force. He helped me move furniture without taking over, offered opinions when asked but never insisted, and gave me space to figure out what I wanted without pressure. Our relationship evolved organically. Coffee dates became lunch meetings, which extended into dinner and evening walks through the city. He took me to art galleries where we debated the merits of abstract expressionism, to quiet parks where we read on separate benches but shared the same peaceful silence, to a rooftop garden where fairy lights twinkled above the city skyline. Each date felt intentional, designed around learning who I was rather than impressing me with grand gestures. I was fall for him slowly, carefully, but undeniably. The difference between this and what I'd felt for Derrick was staggering. This felt like choosing rather than settling, like building rather than compromising away pieces of myself. But the past had a way of intruding on the present. I was grabbing coffee in the office cafeteria when Derrick approached, looking haggard in a way that might have concerned me weeks ago. Now I just felt a distant sadness for both of us. "Jordan, please," he started, his voice low and urgent. "Can we talk? Really talk?" I glanced around the cafeteria, acutely aware of curious eyes turning our direction. "This isn't the place, Derrick." "Then where?" he pressed. You won't return my calls, you've blocked me on everything. I just need 5 minutes to explain. There's nothing left to explain, I said quietly but firmly. We've said everything that needed saying. No, we haven't, he insisted, desperation creeping into his tone. You left without giving me a real chance to make things right. I've been going to therapy, Jordan. I'm working on myself. Doesn't that count for something? Part of me recognized the effort, acknowledged that change was difficult. But a larger part understood that his growth wasn't my responsibility to witness or validate. I'm glad you're getting help, I said genuinely. But I've moved on. You need to do the same. Before Derrick could respond, George appeared at my elbow. He didn't touch me, didn't make any possessive gestures, but his presence shifted the dynamic immediately. Everything all right here? He asked, his tone professional but laced with protective concern. Derrick's face contorted with anger and humiliation. This is a private conversation, he bit out. Actually, I interjected before the situation could escalate. We're done here. Derrick, I wish you well, but we have nothing more to discuss. I walked away without looking back, George falling into step beside me. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline, but I felt proud rather than guilty for holding my boundary. That must have been difficult, George observed once we were alone in the elevator. Not as difficult as I expected, I admitted. Mostly I just felt done. Like closing a book I'd already finished reading. George studied my face for a moment, then smiled. You've grown a lot these past few weeks. It's remarkable to witness. His words warmed something inside me that had been cold for too long. That evening, George picked me up for what he mysteriously called a special occasion. He drove us to a rooftop restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to visit months ago in a casual conversation. The fact that he'd remembered such a small detail made my heart swell. The city spread out beneath us in a carpet of lights as we ate. Conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences and shared laughter. Over dessert, George reached across the table and took my hand. Jordan, I want to ask you something, but I need you to know there's no pressure attached to your answer. My pulse quickened. All right. These past few weeks with you have been incredible, he began, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. I've watched you rediscover yourself, watched you become more confident and self-assured, and I've found myself falling for you, not the person you were pretending to be, but the real you that's been emerging. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I know the timing isn't perfect, you're still healing, still figuring things out, but I don't want to keep dancing around what I feel. Would you be willing to make this official? To try building something real together? My eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than pain. For so long, commitment had felt like a trap, like losing myself to someone else's expectations. But George was offering partnership, mutual growth, a relationship built on respect and genuine affection. Yes, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. I want that too. George's smile could have powered the city lights below us. He stood, pulling me up with him, and wrapped me in an embrace that felt like coming home. When he kissed my forehead, gentle and reverent, I understood what love was supposed to feel like: safe, uplifting, expansive rather than constricting. As we stood on that rooftop under the stars, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Derrick's cruelty had broken something in me, but George's kindness had helped me rebuild stronger. The scarf that had started everything was still tucked away in my apartment. A reminder that my love had always been worthy. I'd just been offering it to someone who couldn't appreciate its value. Now I'd found someone who understood that handmade gifts weren't childish, but precious. That vulnerability wasn't weakness, but courage. That love should feel like expansion rather than diminishment. This wasn't just a new relationship, it was a new life. One I was finally brave enough to choose for myself. And standing there in George's arms, with the city lights twinkling below and possibilities stretching endlessly ahead, I knew I'd made the right choice. Not just in choosing him, but in choosing myself first. That made all the difference.